Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the paper by Juliana Reinecke and I that's going to be forthcoming in the Journal of Supply Chain Management. In terms of our research, the starting point of our research of this paper very much comes from the perspective that supply chain management scholars and industrial relations scholars approach issues around labour issues, work conditions and the like from very different perspectives and from very different underlying philosophies in terms of our research approach. So our argument is that supply chain management scholars often look at the issue of labour standards as a technical issue, like a factor of production, an issue which can be managed by the organisation, and very much an issue through which management can develop the right way to manage the issue and therefore implement it in order to improve working conditions within the supply chain. And in this way, codes of conduct have very much dominated research within the supply chain management literature on this issue. And in this way, the key very much has become one of looking at how to design systems, how to design codes, how to design the implementation, how to monitor it, and to carry out these sorts of activities in order to work out how labour conditions, supply chains can be improved. Now, from a very different perspective, which is where Juliana and I come from, the argument is that the issue of labour standards is inherently political. It's not something where there's a right way to do it or a wrong way to do it, but that essentially labour issues are essentially a struggle between divergent interests over how to manage them within the supply chain context. And what we do in this paper is we build on the theory of industrial democracy to look at what that means in terms of improving labour standards. And the core argument then becomes one of, in order to design and implement good labour standards, workers need to be involved in the design, the implementation, the monitoring, and it's what we label in the paper worker-driven supply chain governance. So this paper is essentially a call for scholars within the supply chain, from the supply chain perspective, to recognize this political nature of employment relations, labour standards and the like, and to take a more what we regard a politicized approach to examine labour standards. And essentially through that, we build this concept of what we call worker-driven supply chain as informed by the theory of industrial democracy. The research presented in this paper essentially is getting towards the end of a 7-year project which my colleague Juliana Reinecke and I have been carrying out, looking at the responses to the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh from 2013, which killed over 1,100 workers. And this research draws upon longitudinal data collection involving, I think, 7 field trips to Dhaka, where we visited factories, met with worker representatives, trade unionists, NGOs, factory managers, factory owners, and also research at the other end of the supply chain when we interviewed key actors within Europe, North America and the like from buyer firms. And one of the key themes that has emerged from our research was that many of the responses to Rana Plaza have been very different to other supply chain responses in terms of managing the labour standards and supply chain. In that, within a number of significant activities that took place, workers and the role of worker voice, worker representation has been placed as a central part within that agenda. And in the paper, we highlight that when we talk about worker representation and worker voice, it's not just about worker voice at the factory level or worker voice with the international buyer companies, but that it can take place at the factory level, with the international buyer company level, or a mixture of both. And within this paper, we draw upon three parts of our research. The first part looks at the Bangladesh Accord, which was an initiative involving over 220 international buyer firms, 2 global union federations, Bangladeshi unions, and 4 NGOs in terms of developing a supply chain governance perspective. But within that project, while on the one hand, it started at the transnational level, there was also significant factory level, workplace level activity with the development of worker representation through occupational safety and health committees in Bangladesh. So within that context, when we talk about worker-driven supply chain governance, we're seeing the development of a mechanism which involves workers engaging with the buyer firms, but also engaging with management at the local level over occupational safety and health. In one of the other projects we draw upon, which was the joint ethical trade initiatives of the UK, Denmark, and Norway project, it was very much focused on the idea of getting democratic worker representatives to meet with management to discuss issues of their agenda within the factories that they were working in. And finally, so that was very much at the worker level. And then only the transnational level, it was the response to the Ashulia jailings of trade unionists and the idea that buyer firms, Western buyer firms, were leveraged in order to get them to place pressure on the Bangladeshi government and Bangladeshi industry to release these trade unionists over the industrial action that was occurring in Ashulia in Bangladesh. And for us, one of the key features, lessons of the paper, of the idea is that within this context, the lead buyer firms from developed economies played really important roles in terms of ensuring that supplier factories lived up to improving standards, engaged, and the like. But similarly, that can't be thought of, or argument is, as an altruistic action by these buyer firms, but it's essentially because many of these firms are more exposed to negative features, negative publicity, negative action than the supplier firms within Bangladesh. And from that, we developed a conceptual framework for understanding how interactions can take place at these different levels, and how these can take place at the various levels and lead to meaningful change within the supply chain, but also see it as inherently political, because it was essentially the buyer firms responding to pressure being placed on them by labor act forms of unions and NGOs. In terms of taking the research agenda forward, we're currently working a number of other journal articles as well as this article from our research. But certainly the central piece of our research is going to be presented in a book published by Cambridge University Press next year. And this draws across a number of the key themes in terms of worker-driven supply chain governance and industrial democracy being the central theoretical foundation of the book, with more detail on the cases. So we see this as being very much our core effort over the next few months. And in many ways, the article in the Journal of Supply Chain Management provides a taster for what's come out later on in the book, and around the core themes and the core empirical data which the book is going to be based around. In terms of wider questions that we think this paper raises for scholars in supply chain management areas, It's important to note that one of the key areas we've looked at, the key area we've looked at to date, has been supply chains within the apparel sector, and which that's generally associated with having the lowest labor standards probably of all globalized industries. So an important element as well is going to be looking at what differences worker-driven supply chains governance can make in contexts that are based around other industries, higher skill, higher cost industries. In addition, within this paper, the research very much focuses on issues around supply chains where buyer companies exert the most power. And other core areas that we believe are ripe for further investigation also include those areas where actually suppliers retain key power. We think about things like many commodities and the like, where supply is low and the suppliers maintain significant power within the supply chain. We see that as being an interesting area to investigate. What differences can be discerned, or does it make any differences when it's much more supplier end? I think in terms of general focus as well, one of the points it's important to make is, and this very much goes back to the sector, is that there's a big focus in recent years being placed around environmental issues and things like fast fashion, disposable fashion, where people buy a piece of clothing for €10 or $10 and dispose of it after wearing it once. And that very much has become a big cause for environmental action in recent years. But also, the research that we're looking at very much looks at the human costs as well as the environmental costs. And our hope is that in the future, we can see more people within the supply chain management discipline taking on this issue around the human misery as well as the environmental effects. And I think we see those as being core areas going forward. But in many ways, just as a reflection on this is coming towards the end of our project, having been carrying out the research for the last 7 years, I think just as a bit of a reflection, it's worth noting that this research emerged from looking at the worst industrial disaster to hit workers in living memory. And without doubt, the research has been interesting, challenging, engaging, been really something that's got policy actors interested, it's got practitioners interested, but it's always at the back of your mind about the 1,100 workers who were mainly young female workers from rural Bangladesh who moved to Dhaka for a better life, that essentially died as part of this supply chain. And in many ways, we'd hope that one of the legacies of the research and one of the messages that can come through down the line is that we need to be looking at research that looks at responses, but doesn't just see responses in terms of, on the one, trying to match profitability with better standards, but also looks at the human beings and the effect of driving down labor costs in the name of efficiency has as industry develops. We would hope that one of the key lessons is that this paper brings supply chain management scholars as well the idea that social rights, social performance has to be viewed as an outcome of its own and not just part of a wider program of looking at economic efficiency.